uglier form, went over it, helped us think about it. And so I'm super grateful to Kim for his help with the book. It's a much better book, but also really excited to have him here today.
Cool.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, which will take me just a second. And what I'll do is I'll walk through a little bit of a talk about the book, and invite Kim to weigh in as I'm walking through this talk. And then we'll switch to a part of the afternoon where Kim and I talk back and forth, and then we'll have Q&A at the very end. I want to start very broadly in thinking about this book and sort of framing it outside of what's actually in the book. And I think one way to do that is to think about art and writing. And if we think about art and writing, there is a very long history of writers and artists that put flavor and deliciousness in the center of their works. This is true of still life. Still life is this radical movement wherein foods and other inanimate but often delicious things take the place of kings and religious figures. But it's also true in poetry. And so I thought I'd share two poems to sort of set the stage for what we'll talk about. The first is by William Carlos Williams. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox in which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. And then this other poem, also by William Carlos Williams, to a poor old woman munching a plum on the street, a paper bag of them in her hand. They taste good to her. They taste good to her. They taste good to her. You can see it by the way she gives herself to the one half sucked out in her hand, comforted, a solace of ripe plums seeming to fill the air. They taste good to her. And I've shared these because what Monica and I hope we have done in this book is to revisit the human story with the same attention to flavor and deliciousness that Williams offers to the plum. In short, we consider why it tastes good to her, but also why it matters that it does. And in doing this, we tried to wed the Kim's world, the world of culinary professionals, and the perspective of chefs and food professionals, and the perspectives of ecology, evolutionary biology, primatology, paleoanthropology, archaeology, cultural anthropology, history, neuroscience, chemistry, and more. And so the great part about this is for Monica and for me, is we got to spend 2 years going around the world talking to people about food and eating great food and writing about food and trying to figure out what these different fields knew and how to connect across those fields. Our argument in the book is that in many of the key transitions in human evolution, flavor played a role, and that when confronted with a more delicious food and a less delicious food, our ancestors tended to choose the more delicious food. They chose what tasted good to them, and from such choices, much follows. In the book, we cover a whole series of mysteries from stick tools to food sharing. Those mysteries sort of roughly overlap with the chapters. Today, we have time to just talk a little bit about 3 of those: stick tools, culinary traditions, and fermentation. If there's time, maybe we can get to fire because fire's fun, but we'll see where we get. I'm going to start with stick tools. When I talk about stick tools, I'm talking about things like a stick that a chimpanzee uses to get termites out of a termite mound, but also things like all of our utensils, which might not be sticks anymore, but have their roots in ancient sticks. And if we look across our living relatives, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons, and this is a family tree of us and those living relatives. What we see is that chimpanzees, humans, gorillas, and orangutans all at least sometimes use stick tools. But chimpanzees and humans use them actually very often. And so what primatologists tend to assume is that our common ancestor also used stick tools very often. And so there are 2 ways you could study this. One way is you can go look for these kinds of tools, and people have done this. And so these are actually not stick tools, they're bone tools, but they're much of the same ilk. And these are 1.2 to 2 million years old. And these are thought to have been used to access termites. And so these were used by probably, depending on your nomenclature, maybe Homo erectus on the earlier end. And so these are amazing, but they don't allow us to do very much because there are very few of them that have been discovered. All the ones that were really sticks have rotted. But the other approach that we can use is to watch what chimpanzees do when they use stick tools and to assume that our ancestors may have done something similar and to learn from that. And so here I'm just going to play a quick video, and it just shows different kinds of tool use by chimpanzees. There's one vignette in here of chimpanzees stacking rocks up. This happens at multiple populations. Nobody has any idea what it's about. I won't talk about it today, but it's kind of cool. This is the rocks. I'll talk about this. That's nut cracking. See the baby hanging out. And so here, these are all ways that chimpanzees use tools. There are actually many more, and people have begun to study this tool use in all sorts of interesting ways. But one of the questions people are really interested in, and I'll get to quickly here, is why did chimpanzees use tools? Why did our ancestors use tools? Why did they innovate them? And the standard answer to this question, the one that involves nothing culinary, nothing to do with pleasure, is that they did so to get more calories to feed their ever larger brains that require a lot of energy, which is to say to optimize. But this is a weird kind of thing. It's a thing we do when we talk about animals and we don't do when we talk about ourselves. I mean, none of us probably optimizes in eating, right? We don't optimize our caloric intake. Or if we do, it's now problematic. But somehow we imagine that chimpanzees optimize. And what Monica and I, when we started to talk to primatologists about this, saw very quickly is that when chimpanzees are actually making the decision to use a tool, they seem to have way more interest not in optimizing, but instead in pleasure. And so what if the answer to this question is that our ancestors innovated stick tools not to optimize, but to get more tasty foods, and those foods then happen to often have more calories? And so we started thinking about this in the context of the book, and there's a longer backstory here. But the little quick background that's necessary before we go further here is to recognize that I'm going to use the words associated with taste and flavor in maybe a different way than we use them when we talk about them in our daily lives. And so taste, as I use it, is just what the tongue detects with taste receptors. Mouthfeel is the physical sense of touch in the mouth. Retronasal aromas are the aromas we smell after food is in our mouth. So the chemicals from those aromas go to the back of our nose, and we detect them that way. They're not sniffed at all. Chemesthesis is what we detect with spicy foods or menthol. And then flavor is all of those things together, plus some other ones. And so what we think with tool use is that it's really about taste per se, maybe about mouthfeel. That tool use may be because chimpanzees are finding tastier, mouthfeelier foods. And so with taste, that could be sweeter, saltier, more savory. And in general, we think of taste as leading us toward our ancient needs and away from dangers. And so if chimpanzees tend to follow their taste, they'll tend to get what they need. And then mouthfeel, some of the foods they get maybe are crunchier or fattier. The picture of Kim here is to remind me to say that often I think people don't know very much about umami. Kim, do you have a good example of an umami-rich food?
Yeah, like soy sauce, miso, any fermented or cured or long-aged meats and cheeses. They have that real deep sort of, explosion of like savoriness to them. So it tends to be like long-aged things, but also mushrooms and tomatoes, although the dried ones are like substantially more than the fresher ones. So yeah.
Yes, we can imagine that, and so the chimpanzees, we and chimpanzees both have taste receptors for umami, and so we could imagine that they get more umami-y foods by using their stick tools. But how would we know? I think the first thing we can imagine is if tool use is about taste, the foods chimpanzees get with tools should be tastier than those otherwise available. And the good news about this is that for the most part, the taste receptors of chimpanzees and humans are very similar. Bitter is quite different. And so if something that we eat tastes bitter to us, it might not be bitter to a chimpanzee. And so in theory, if somebody went out and tasted all the foods the chimpanzees eat and then described them, we would have some measure of what the different foods taste like and whether they're wanting. Fortunately, primatologists do this all the time. And in fact, Toshisada Nishida, who started work at Mahale Mountain National Park at about the same time that Jane Goodall started work at Gombe, actually did this exhaustive study of following chimps for years to taste all the things, all the plant foods that they ate. And what we would hope he did when he did this, well, first of all, we hope that like Kim was along, or somebody who had daily experience working with food, describing food, somebody who would be able to say about what he tasted, what Briat Savary said here, which is, whoever eats a peach, for example, is first of all agreeably struck by the smell emanating from it. He puts it into his mouth and experiences a sensation of freshness and acerbity, which invites him to proceed, but it is not until the moment when he swallows and the mouthful passes beneath the nasal channel that the perfume is revealed to him, completing the sensation which every peach ought to cause. And finally, it is only after as he has swallowed that he passes judgment upon his experience and exclaims, delicious. This is not what Nishida did. Instead, he tasted all of the fruits of the jungle and he broke them down into 8 categories. And that was basically it. But it's still helpful. And so these are the categories. And this is the relative proportions of species in the different categories. Remember, bitter doesn't tell us much. But these other do. And so a lot of the fruits were pretty insipid. They were bland. Some were astringent, which is to say they make the mouth pucker, like some wines. Some were sour or sweet and sour, and many were sweet. And Nishida found that the sweetest fruits were the most preferred both by him and the chimpanzees. But even the sweets weren't very sweet. On average, Nishida found the foods of chimpanzees to be at best bland. And so this suggests that maybe there's something wanting. And what we do see when we look at the foods that they eat with their tools is that they're very often tastier, and they're also things that are eaten by humans. And so the same ants that chimpanzees eat are eaten by humans and described as delicious. Sour, they have a nice mouthfeel, they're crunchy. The chimpanzees eat algae. We like algae. Algae is very often umami. The prototypical umami food is the algae that you put in dashi broth. Very sweet. The honey is super sweet. The termites are very fatty. The nuts are fatty and umami. And so in theory, these all seem like they might taste better. But if taste is the guide rather than optimization, modern apes might be expected to sometimes eat things that taste good, but that do not benefit them. Does this happen? And so this is where it gets really interesting, because for as much as the chimpanzees eat ants, for example, well, let me pause for a second. So we don't think of ants as very tasty, I think, often, but it's around the world globally, people love the ants and other insects. Kim and my friend Joshua Evans led this amazing book that you should check out about eating insects and the flavors and experiences of insects around the world. And ants are liked around the world. And so we should imagine them as tasty. And on the map here, what you see is all the chimpanzee populations in orange where the chimpanzees eat ants. But although the chimpanzees use sticks to eat ants at all these sites, and they're incredibly common, there appears no nutritional benefit to eating the ants. Nishida concluded they were simply snacks. And so this seems like, kind of a waste of time. It doesn't ruin the chimpanzees, but it's not, there's no clear benefit to doing it. A better example is from work by Dr. Victoria Etienne, the Max Planck Institute. She studied chimpanzees that forage on honey in these ground nesting bees, and these nests can be 6 feet below ground. And that picture that you saw, the video you saw of the chimpanzee pounding like this, that was to get these bees. And so she studied this behavior to see what the chimpanzees are getting out of it. And it raises the question, like, how long would you do this? How long would you pound into the ground to get honey if the sweetest food in your diet was a fig? And I don't know, I could maybe do a day. Kim, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going for a day or so. Like, it depends how long I've been eating really insipid food, I guess.
It's a lot of figs and some leaves, maybe the occasional bark. More than a day, just a day.
Probably a couple of days, yeah.
So the chimpanzees sometimes dig for months or even years. And when they finally get to the honey, they get no more than about a ½ liter of honey, which is about 2,000 calories, which they then have to divide with whoever else happens to be there. And so there's basically no way that this is energetically reasonable. And so I think the only way to think about it is honey just tastes really good. And it's worth pounding on a hole for months and years because of that pleasure. Another example is Maureen McCarthy and Jack Lester work on chimpanzees in a site in Uganda, in this corridor between Budongo and Bugama, which are 2 forests, where sometimes the chimpanzees are in forests and sometimes they're in more fragmented habitat. And they've found that there are populations of chimpanzees, even where forests are available, that move into the sugarcane fields and basically just eat sugarcane all day, every day. And then when they're done, they go and eat some jackfruits. And Maureen and Jack have concluded that this is not, jackfruits are not named for Jack, should be clear, but just in case. It's very unlikely that this much sugar is good for the chimpanzees, but it's just tasty. And so we don't know the long-term consequences yet, but it seems easy to imagine that this is not a good idea for them. The best example, though, it comes not from chimpanzees, but from gorillas. So this fruit, when it's ripe, it looks really sweet. It's bright red. And to humans and most primates, most African primates, it tastes sweet, but it has no sugar. Instead, it makes, so this is a sweet taste receptor, this little thing at the top there. And what's supposed to happen is sugars go into the top and they ring a little chemical bell, and that goes to your brain and it's sweet. But what this fruit does is it produces a protein that hits that taste receptor on that kind of elbow and tricks it into thinking there's something sweet. And so for the plant, the advantage of this is it can make just a tiny amount of this protein, and primates get to the fruit and think it's delicious and sweet and eat tons of it. But what's really interesting is that it was noticed a while ago that gorillas don't eat this fruit. They check it out, but then they don't consume it. And so Dr. Elaine Guevara at Duke University studied this. And what she found is that at some point in the past, and I should also say that the gorilla geographic range, at least for Western gorillas, is within this fruit's range entirely. So there's plenty of this fruit. But what Elaine found is that the sweet taste receptors of these gorillas have actually evolved so they're no longer tricked by that protein. And what Elaine thinks is that some of the gorillas like the falsely sweet fruit so much that their health suffered. Others like them less. The latter gorillas are more likely to thrive and reproduce. It's only their descendants that survive. And so they were eating so much fruit that they were less likely to survive, so much of this tricky fruit. And then, of course, we're the best example of a primate led astray by taste. And so we should imagine that the same things to which we fall victim, they can too. And so we talk a lot more about this in the book, but this is the kind of idea. The second thing I'll talk about, and then I'll come to fermentation, where we can, I think, talk about this more informally, is culinary traditions. Chimpanzees turn out to have culinary traditions. I think these are cultures. Whether you call them cultures is a subject of enormous debate that maybe goes nowhere super productive, so we don't have to do it today. But an example of this culinary tradition is that these 2 sites, Gombe National Park and Mahale Mountain National Park, they're very, very close, 70 kilometers. And they have the same ants and the same plants. But what's been discovered is that the species of ants that the chimpanzees eat at Gombe are these chromatogaster ants and army ants, so the doorless army ants here on the right. And the ants that the chimpanzees eat at the Mahale are these carpenter ants, even though the other ants are present. And this is interpreted as evidence of culinary traditions. There's no difference in the need of these chimpanzees. They just have different traditions and they pass those on. And we've since learned that there are many, many such culinary traditions across chimpanzee populations. And what's really interesting about this is that it allows lasting cultural adaptation to new environments. And sometimes it's, in the case of the ants, it's of no functional consequence, but other cases it is. And it leads to different populations to eat different foods in similar environments. And so if we think about this in the context of our own ancestors, this is potentially an extraordinarily powerful component of how we made sense of the world. Mouth first, as we moved, we formed different culinary cultures. And that allowed us to live in deserts, in tundras, and tropical rainforests. But the question is, how does this happen? You know, especially if you're thinking about our ancestors before they could speak, if you're thinking about chimpanzees that don't speak, they don't write anything down, how does that build up? And what we argue in the book is that a key component of this is olfaction. And if we think about olfaction, there's basically two types. There's sniffing, like the dog is doing here, which is orthonasal olfaction. And it has to do with what goes up the nose. And then there's retronasal olfaction. And so this guy, he is sniffing the bun of the burger, but all of the real burger taste is going from his mouth up into the back of his nose. And if we compare dogs and humans, for example, dogs are really specialized for orthonasal olfaction. They're really good at it. They sniff the world. They're down on the ground. They actually blow air out and it raises molecules and they go back in. The shape of our head actually leads us to be specialized for retronasal olfaction. We specialize on smelling things once they're in our mouths. And this on its own suggests that maybe olfaction plays a really important role in what's going on with these culinary traditions. But the other part that's important here is that olfaction is connected directly to learning via a system that I liken to a card catalog, which makes me seem old, but it's just the right analogy, so I'm still going to use it. And so with card catalogs, what you had, this is what we used to use to find a book in the library. This is the card catalog from the Library of Congress in the US. You would have subject card catalogs and also title cards and author cards. And so you could then sort through and find the book using these different systems. With smell, there's something very similar in our brain. Each time we smell something, that experience receives two cards. One card is associated with something like the title of the experience, a story recorded as a memory. I was eating cheese with my friend and whatever that experience is. And my friend told a funny story and I remembered it. And every time I smell the cheese, I remember that story. The second card just records the subject, cheese. The more different experiences accumulate in a particular subject, the more finely the subject cards are divided. Also, the less random the connections become. So cheeses become divided into hard and soft cheeses, then soft cheeses become divided into blue cheeses, and for example, washed rind cheeses, and so on. And here an expert is someone who can distinguish those things, whose card catalog has many divisions. And so I was going to turn this to you, Kim. Are there smells for which you think you have an unusual number of categories?
Yeah, for sure, especially since I got involved heavily in fermenting and in particular using a lot of funguses for fermenting. So the smells of specific fungus or like fungi that are being used in terms of kojis and stuff like that is something that's very clear to me, but also something that I'm particularly good at smelling is the smell of the mold or funguses that are, you know, perhaps turning something the wrong way. So being quite aware of stuff that's not going right, because
can you walk into a room and have some sense immediately of what's fermenting? Like how narrowly can you identify what's going on?
I mean, if there's a whole bunch of different things fermenting in there, it's going to be a real mashup. It's going to not really to do that sort of thing. But in terms of like opening a container and smelling it and being able to say, perhaps this is being koji fermented and it's got a specific thing to it, or oh, this has got something growing in there that perhaps it shouldn't have, is quite clear.
Yeah, so that's perfect. So that goes to the next thing that smell allows us, which is that each experience is assigned a level of pleasurableness, such that smells that are always associated with pleasurable experiences become good smells, and smells associated with bad experiences become bad smells. In essence, it's like a book review. And so you've got your koji book review comes quickly to, like,
yeah.
The ones you like smell good, or do you
they smell good, and I mean, they definitely get emotive responses to them, I guess, based on pleasant memories and things like that as well, or recollections of other delicious things that had those initial smells. So you can have some very sort of positive emotions going with those things.
So there's this book review thing, or it's more like Yelp almost. So it's cumulative with regard to positive smells. They just sort of build up and get more positive as far as anybody understands. But with negative smells, if you throw up when eating something, the smell that was associated with whatever you ate, you learn to be a bad smell in one go. And it's actually called the Garcia effect for some guy who's known for nothing else. Poor guy.
Can you immediately turn a good smell into a bad smell by just having a bad experience with that formerly positive smell?
Yep. That's the Garcia effect.
Yeah.
Which is super. And so in this way that we're talking about, like, smell becomes this library that's really much older than our most ancient libraries. And it's a library rooted at the interface of the nose and the brain. And what's super cool about this is that late in life, like when Kim is making new ferments, not late in life, early, but not baby. Later in life, we still learn these smells, we learn new ones, we learn to distinguish them, but it actually starts this whole process very early. And we know this from studies of pregnant mothers. And a lot of this work is by Benoit Schall, working in France. And so, for example, Schall did this amazing study where he had two groups of pregnant mothers, one half of which ate anise when they were pregnant, anise candies, anise, whatever they wanted, and the other half did not. And then the babies at 3 hours after birth were compared to see what happened if you waved an anise smelling Q-tip in front of their nose. Did they do a scrunchy face displeasure or a lick-lipping pleasure? And then they also waved Q-tips with nothing on them. And what they saw was the babies whose moms ate anise did the lick-lipping faces far more often than the babies who did not. Conversely, the babies whose moms did not eat anise did the scrunchy faces much more often. And in fact, the babies whose mothers ate anise almost never did the scrunchy faces. And so it's an amazing study, and there's since been many more, and it's now very clear that babies learn any smell that goes through the amniotic fluid in utero as a good smell. And so they're born liking any of those things they're exposed to. And that includes garlic, it includes fermented fish, it includes blue cheese, it includes vegetables. And so this is this amazing moment of teaching. This is what our people eat that happens even before the baby's born. And so if you think about our ancestors moving to new places, that first generation's hard. You've got to learn which thing is deadly and which one's delicious. But the second generation is born to some extent already knowing. And so what a tool with which to explore the world. And then once we can speak, obviously we can reinforce the bonds around culture and food, and it really becomes quite powerful. And we also become able to create. And we talk a lot in the book about creating new kinds of food and how that works. I won't talk much about it today, except in the context of fermentation. But I like this poem by Jane Hirschfield because it's about taking something that doesn't seem palatable and making it delicious. My species, Even a small purple artichoke boiled in its own bittered and darkening waters grows tender and sweet. Patience, I think, my species, keep testing the spiny leaves. And so keep testing them, keep figuring out what's good, and then teach your babies in utero. And that way you know the world, which I think is really this amazing form of learning. And I was going to ask you, Kim, about something you already said, so I'll skip it here.
I was going to say also, just when you touch on the epigenetics there, though, it also it gives something to that statement where people always think their mum's food is the best, and behavior. It's not just maternal love. Maybe it's it's actually been bred into us.
Well, and there's the example in the book that I know you like, Kim, that the at least in mice can learn across multiple generations.
Oh yeah.
To dislike foods associated with fear. And so one study,
like 6 generations, I think.
Yeah, five or 6. And so imagine that your great grandmother was terrified in light of a Brussels sprout. You could be doing you damage still today, and you have no idea why.
Exactly.
And so a lot gets passed. So I'm going to pull us toward fermentation, and then just jump in as I'm talking here now, Kim, because now we're moving to sort of bread and butter stuff from your daily life. Fermentation is another mystery we deal with in the book. It's a bigger mystery. We know far less about it. And it has 2 components. One is, when does control of fermentation begin? And just for context, fermented foods include cheese, fermented fish, beer, wine, cider, kimchi, sauerkraut, leavened bread, soy sauce, fish paste, kombucha, cured ham, and literally thousands and thousands of other foods united by the reality that they have been transformed, which is to say created through control of microbes. The story about fermentation used to be, until very recently, well, this is sort of our culinary story in general. We have stick tools for like 6 million years. We eat lots of plants, some insects. About 1.9 million years ago, we start to mash stuff with stone tools. Maybe we have fire. And then 12,000 years ago or so, depending where you are, we get agriculture. And then everybody focuses on beer, which comes after agriculture once you have extra grains. But there'd always been a sneaking suspicion that maybe the order here was wrong. And in the last 3 years, it's become clear that that sneaking suspicion is right, that fermentation very clearly now precedes agriculture. The oldest clear evidence of fermentation of any kind is from Israel, and it's beer from a time before, well, it's from what is now Israel, in a time before anything was being farmed. And so these are the old fermentation chambers. They were stone. And one interpretation here is that people started making beer. It was so damn pleasing that once they ran out of like readily accessible grains, they had to figure out a farm to keep making beer.
That's it. Isn't the theory we stopped becoming travelers in order to get drunk?
It's argued often. It's plausible. It's hard to substantiate. Yeah. You just mean you.
Well,
you meant the collective we. Yeah. I'm just joking, Kim.
As a species, we stopped wandering the world so we could farm and get drunk.
Yeah, and so this does support that in the sense that these are settled locations before agriculture. And so they weren't farming yet, but already they were laying down roots and getting drunk to some extent. And we're making experimental beers in the lab to figure out how drunk they might have been, but the answer appears to be pretty drunk. But the other thing that's recently happened is that Katie Amato, who we talk about a lot in the book at Northwestern University, has started to argue that maybe the control of fermentation goes back much, much further. And she even wonders whether Homo erectus could have fermented. And I won't talk about it much today, other than to say that in thinking about this, Katie really leans on studies of modern primates. And she's found many examples of modern primates eating fermented fruits. And this capuchin monkey actually appears to intentionally ferment the fruits that it's holding here. These are almendro fruits. It knocks them down, it leaves them on the ground and comes back 3 weeks later and eats them when they've become like kombucha-y, a little bit yeasty, maybe a little bit alcoholic. And so if you imagine that a capuchin monkey can control fermentation, you have to imagine that probably our ancestors at least had the ability to. But the other question that Kim already offered some answer to, and so I'll get to it quick, is how did our ancestors know which ferments were safe? And this comes out in a clear form in the context of work done by Dan Fisher at the University of Michigan. So Dan Fisher discovered several sites in Michigan, in the US and elsewhere, where he thinks that mastodons, so furry kin to the elephant, were killed, eaten a little bit, and then a family pushed them in their pond and anchored them to the bottom of the pond so that they would ferment over winter so they'd be available in the hardest times of the year. And so it looks very plausible, but Dan wanted to figure out, is it possible? And so a friend of his had a horse that died. I shouldn't show such a pretty horse because what's going to happen is not good. And used stone tools to cut it up and weigh it down in a pond. And then Dan went back to it and sampled it each month over 4 or 5 months. And the 5th month said it had a flavor like Stilton cheese and steak all in one, and it was sour. And it's this experiment that really makes me think, how did they figure out how not to do this in a way that killed themselves? And my answer is the answer that you already gave, Kim, and maybe you can talk more about it, which is that I think that learning through olfaction would have been very important. You know, learning so what do you think? Is that plausible?
I mean, yeah, I think there's like, you know, with this sort of fermentation, and especially with fermentation of meat, there's smells in there of rot and decay, but there's a very fine line between stuff that's fermenting and obviously starting to break down, but still has this deep, rich deliciousness to it, and stuff that just smells bad. And the stuff that smells bad, you don't particularly want to put in your mouth, but the other stuff, even though it's got this like kind of warning sort of triggers kicking you, you're like, your hands kind of still slowly moving to your mouth with it anyway, because it's got this deliciousness to it, you know? And you probably only have to like do it once right and then do it once terribly wrong to be able to like distinguish that and know which one you're going for each time.
Yeah, that's amazing. We should have had you write this part of the book. But yeah, so I think it's a very plausible way they could have learned really quickly without writing it down, you know. And then we also argue that so the other thing that happens here is that we know that for a lot of these ferments, that the microbes that are used to do the fermentation come on the bodies of the people. And so we did this big experiment with bakers where we showed that bakers actually contribute some of their body microbes to their sourdough starters and that you can taste that flavor. But we also showed that the sourdough starter changed the hands of the bakers so that their hands were like little starters. And so you can imagine, like, if you keep doing these ferments, they change your body microbes. And so like your body smell and the food smell, like those are all the good ones that you know and love. And so it's this feedback on it too.
Absolutely. It's long-standing tradition when like teaching people in the kitchen and things that you as a person are the greatest inoculator to your ferments. You know, you contribute your flavor or your taste of hand. Everything you make is specifically yours because it's come from your own microbiome and you've touched it, which is it's really interesting. Unfortunately, there are people out there with not the greatest mix of microbiomes going on, and the ferments they make can be quite undelicious. But generally, yeah, it's really interesting for people to know that what they touch and what they ferment is uniquely theirs.
There's a Korean word, somaf. I'm probably saying it not quite right, but it's the hand flavor that a person who cooks gives to food.
Yeah, I was taught this by a 90-year-old Japanese woman when I was living there, who was teaching me about miso, and she didn't understand the whole science or anything behind it, but she knew that the miso I was making beside her from exactly the same ingredients was going to be mine, and hers was going to be hers. And when we can come back and taste them next year, hers would taste different to mine because she had made it. Which was fascinating, absolutely fascinating to learn that.
I think for us, that was a real learning experience. And we're like 3 slides short of the end here. And so I may just even stop here and we'll just talk. That very often we found that chefs and and home bakers, home fermenters had much more sophisticated ideas about some aspects of food and flavor than much more holistic ideas than sometimes scientists studying the same thing did. And
Right.
so like that concept that you give microbes and flavor to the food, it's really common in many cultures, and it's common among people who do fermentation, but in the scientific literature, it's basically entirely missing. And so we kept finding those, which were really exciting because then you can bring people together and you can
Right. And
learn from
it's
that
a big
knowledge.
sort of aspect of our own food that we really strongly tried to stamp out when we modernized. We got rid of everything that was like by chance and really sterilized our food for a big section. And then there is a large sort of trend coming back to whole foods that are fermented and contain living cultures. But yeah, for a long time we really industrialized the crap out of that and tried to get rid of all of that sort of living connection to our food.
So do you so when you were spending more time in the kitchen, so your clientele were very international, right, at a mass.
Yeah.
Did you sometimes find a tension between cooking for a specific food culture and people that know a specific kind of food versus cooking for things that were going to appeal to people that had very different sort of olfactory libraries of food? How do you
Yeah,
negotiate with that?
absolutely. Like everybody's unique, right? Even just on a like side by side basis in terms of our own flavor world that we live in. And it comes more down to probably like cultural relationships of what is delicious, rather than just sort of people's individual ability to taste things, because we have more than like a 16-fold difference in taste receptors to the person next to you, right? Like our own taste world is so different, but it's the culture that we're raised in that tells people what we do. Luckily, Amass is kind of known as this place that's pushing boundaries like that, so you tend to come there with an open mind to what you're eating. We're certainly not extreme in as many senses in serving insects or pushing people's like uncomfortableness of what they could be eating, but we're certainly serving a lot of strong flavors that can surprise people sometimes as well, I guess.
Yeah, that's best. I mean, when you're cooking for a broad audience like that, even if you're cooking for one that expects to be challenged, do you sometimes make foods that you yourself might not like?
I mean, I think you kind of have to, like I don't like a couple of flavors, but that doesn't mean I won't use them if it's the right place to use it. I really hate green peppers, like green capsicums. They're just offensive. But if there was something where that was the particular thing that filled the niche, then sure, like why not,
Where are we? So we should just probably tip to the audience pretty soon here. I'll just
Yeah.
show the last little. The other thing that we think is important with fermentation is sour taste receptors. And sour taste receptors, there's not a single scientific paper written about why we have them. And so we've been spending a lot of time exploring them. And this seems like actually an interesting part of this, and that just to show this quickly, Aaron McKinney, among others, studies sourdough bread. And Aaron shown that if you take a sourdough starter, so you mix flour and water and look at it over time, that it has more lactic acid bacteria as time goes. And as a result, those lactic acid bacteria produce more acid and make the pH go down. And so there's a point at which it tastes acidic, which is the same point at which the pathogens tend to have been killed off by that same acid. And so we think that the tongue also serves this role of an additional check on safety in this context.
Right. Is it? I mean, it's probably like most things, though, right? Like the first fermented fruits were eaten by somebody or something that was really hungry, and then didn't die.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. Yeah.
And so then you can come back to it, and that this is acceptable to eat, and we can then start developing a taste for it.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's good to have cousins, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Well, so I was going to ask you some, Kim, about if you were thinking in the context of some of these time periods, what you might, so if you were working with the chimpanzee's repertoire, like what might you want to cook? Or if you're working with Homo erectus's repertoire 1.9 million years ago, maybe that's a more fun one.
I mean, the chimpanzee one, it's surprisingly like open though. They're omnivorous, so you've got access to meat and fish and crustaceans and things like that, as well as they're also known for eating these things in pairings, right? Like you have the chimps who spear bush babies and then season it with herbs while they're eating it. So you're pretty much in the like carpaccio realm already, with like raw meat and some herbs and a few berries on top of that. They just don't have the knife technique yet.
I sense a new pop-up restaurant in Copenhagen coming.
Right, it's the new paleo, is chimp diet.
Yes, it's so paleo. It's largely herbivorous.
Exactly.
So maybe
also, Homo erectus, like they had access to even more sort of thing, because then they had fire as well, right? And
yeah, eventually
like,
they get fire.
While raw meat can be delicious, cooked meat is more delicious more often, which is probably why we stuck around with doing that, because it's just sort of a lot more delicious, right? And then you have with them a larger tool repertoire, I guess, so you can get into some really sort of fun cooking.
Yeah, we mostly know about their stone tools, which were pretty simple, but it's assumed they also had this whole, cook's tool set of stick tools to do all kinds of stuff.
I mean, we know like how many the chimps carry dozens, right, of like individual tools for very specific purposes. So you would think that we also were carrying quite a large toolkit around the place.
I'm going to stop sharing it here, Kim, so we can start getting some questions if there are any other things in the chat. Let's see.
Hi, I'm just popping on to encourage folks to use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen if you have questions for Rob or Kim. I do have a question to get our ball rolling, though. One thing I've been curious about reading the book and thinking about the topic is how in 2021, and especially how things have moved so into the virtual space, one thing that's changing our food and flavor landscape exponentially is the rise of social media and how we have such influence on each other to pursue new foods and flavors these days. So I'm wondering if either of you have any beloved or hated food trends in the era of social media. If you could speak to that.
Go for it, Kim. I have a follow-up, but it's not the first thing. Yeah.
Here we go. And we're starting to get some questions now too. So, I think with social media, there's this huge push to make things look really pretty for a photo. Stuff that might either be sort of not realistic to make in a functional setting and such, but there's this real desire that everything needs to be looked at like spectacularly photo friendly, and it's become sort of as important. It's like, well, I've made this dish and I've done this now. Is it the best photo friendly dish it can be, and will it attract other people based on its just the way that it looks?
So I originally heard the question in a slightly different way, which is I was thinking about how does that relate? So it's a kind of food sharing, right? The social media sharing of food. And we know from studies of chimpanzees that when they share food, they get the same hormone running through their bodies that mothers get when they hold their babies, which eventually triggers an endorphin rush. And so, you can think of food sharing as having this pleasing feature to it in and of itself. But do you also get that feeling if you're sharing food online or you're sharing the idea of food? Or maybe we disconnected that.
You get a feeling of knowing you're creating some kind of like envy or jealousy to what you're eating.
Yeah, I guess that's a different kind of, but we can also be pleased by that. Yeah.
Yeah. So we got one here. Someone would like to know, why is it important to understand taste, and why do we put so much effort into taste?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, so I think taste and flavor can seem silly, right? That it's about pleasure, it's about it feels like it's about high food. But what we argue in the book is that many of the decisions we've made relate to the perceptions associated with flavor. And so if we're going to understand those decisions, we have to understand the sensory system that led to them. And so if you think about the transition in our diet associated with industrialization of food, well, the way in which we've, in essence, become deeply connected to the cereal aisle at the grocery store, for example, is using the same flavor processes that a chimpanzee is using in the forest, but they're just applied in this different context. And so it helps us make more sense of those decisions. And in that context, what's really happening is that an industry has replaced your parents with regard to training you which flavors are good. And so you're learning that simple taste, sugar, with a few aroma compounds are the thing that your culture eats. And so this same process that allows some chimpanzees to love a particular ant has allowed many of us to love an industrial food supply with many lacking features. And so I think it's important in making sense of that. But I think every day we're making decisions on the basis of flavor. And so I think it also matters there. But it also matters if we're talking about what our dogs eat, what wild species eat, how do we conserve species? All the species around us are making flavor decisions. What a crow eats or doesn't eat. And so it's really this critical interface between animal life and food. And so I would argue that it's important in that context, but I also just think it's enjoyable to think about. And sometimes things can just be enjoyable.
Yeah, definitely. This one's straight out of your book almost, but we go, haven't fruit trees, or specifically like larger fruit trees, co-evolved with megafauna to produce larger and fleshier and sweeter fruits with more seeds?
Yes. So we write it. So we have a whole chapter about it in the book, and so about papayas, about mangoes, about avocados, and these giant fruits are almost all species that evolve these big fruits to attract mastodons, mammoths, giant sloths. And after we extinguished these species in Europe and the Americas and elsewhere, we took their place. So we took their fruit and we then began to breed them. But many of our most cherished fruits are relics of that relationship. And like avocados are a super interesting one, that they're clearly megafauna fruits, but they're also really attractive to big cats. And so there's the suggestion that maybe they produce flavors to attract big carnivores in addition to big herbivores and fruit eaters. And so that relationship is really very interesting. The short answer though is yes.
Yeah, and there's forests where mega fruits are starting to die out, or the trees are starting to die out because there's no longer these animals around to spread their seeds.
Yeah, and disproportionately, the subset of the mega fruited species that are doing well are the subset we like. And so if a species produces mega fruits and we don't like their flavors, many of those species are now very, very rare and in trouble. And so the legacy of the choices we made there is long.
Yeah. I'll have a question for you. So you talk about there's headhunter, or there's hunter gatherers who will 100% chase a certain animal if they see it, and other animals they'll only hunt if they're hungry. But there's ones that and because of this, you hypothesized that in fact there were certain animals that were so delicious we hunted them to extinction. Now, any of them you wished you could have tried? Like the baby mastodon foot, or
I mean, so it's argued, not by us, but we talk about this argument that mastodon and mammoth feet were super delicious, and they're often recorded in cave art. You'll see like a mastodon, or you see a mammoth with just a giant foot, And it almost looks like they were painting a menu and they were like, oh, and the foot is so good. And so I think that would have been interesting to try. Maybe like pig knuckles, maybe you'll put a little vinegar and honey or something. But I mean, there are plenty of plants that we know, even from history, were very important to people, and that are now extinct. And so there are some, there's a Roman plant, the name of which I'm forgetting right now, that the Romans loved. It smelled a little bit like garlic, but was used as a spice. And it's now extinct, and we don't even know what it was. And so I think there are a lot of things that we ate to oblivion, and so don't get to taste anymore.
We do have, since we're rounding our hour, one bonus question we like to ask from Politics and Prose. If you'd both be so kind, is besides this fabulous book, Delicious, is there anything that you're reading on your personal time that you'd like to recommend to our audience out there? It can be fiction, nonfiction, your favorite article lately, but what are you enjoying right now?
So I'm reading, it's the Paul Thoreau book that has sea monsters in the title. And it's early Paul Thoreau book from when he was in the Peace Corps, and starts there and moves forward. And it's uneven, but they're really good pieces, are amazing. So I'm enjoying that right now.
Yeah, I just finished a great book called Gastrophysics, which breaks down the psychology of why we like what we like, and really takes apart flavor as a thing, as to breaks down flavor as sound, flavor as taste, flavor as mouthfeel, flavor as aromas inside and outside of your mouth, and what this all means to us, and how it's, I guess, manipulated in some ways by some people, and even by ourselves as to what we like, which is really interesting.
Thank you both so much. Recommendations straight from the experts. We really want to thank Rob Dunn and Kim Weyendorp and our audience out there for tuning in this afternoon. Your patronage and support enable us to have these kinds of amazing discussions, and we just couldn't do it without the book sales to support it. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase your copy of Delicious, The Evolution of Flavor and How It Made Us, or just head on over to politics-prose.com. And while you're there, we hope you'll check out our events calendar for everything else we've got coming up in April. And from our shelves to yours, we hope you're out there staying safe, staying strong, and staying well read. We'll see you next time, everyone. Thanks again, Rob. Thanks again, Kim.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.